morning air in St. Mary Mead carried the crisp scent of early autumn, a promise of chilly evenings and wood smoke. At the vicarage, a scream shattered the stillness, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps crunching across gravel. Mrs. Elspeth Harding, the vicar's housekeeper, was seen running toward the main house, her face pale, hands trembling. "I swear upon my mother's grave, Reverend, there's a skeleton in the garden shed." She gasped, her voice quivering. The vicar, a kindly man of advancing years, adjusted his spectacles. "A skeleton, you say?" "In the old tool chest, sir. I went in to fetch the trowel for the rose beds, and there it was, staring back at me, empty sockets and all." Word travelled swiftly in the village, and before noon 2 figures approached the vicarage's modest garden. One was Inspector Craddock, his tall frame and steady demeanour giving an air of authority. The other, a lady of seemingly unassuming presence, but with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, Miss Jane Marple. "Good morning, Vicar," she said in her usual mild manner. "I understand there has been a rather unusual discovery." Craddock was already lifting the rusted lid of the old wooden tool chest inside the shed. The skeleton lay curled unnaturally, as if crammed inside. The bones were yellowed with age, the skull tilted as if in silent contemplation. A few strands of rotted fabric clung to what might have once been clothing. A small metal object nestled near the ribcage caught Miss Marple's eye. She bent carefully, plucking it with a gloved hand. "A button," she murmured. "Military, I should think." Craddock took it, rubbing his thumb over the worn engraving. "WWI uniform issue," he confirmed. "But that's strange. No one in the village has been unaccounted for since that time, and there have been no reports of missing persons, at least not recently." Miss Marple glanced at the vicar. "How long has this shed been in use?" "Oh, decades, Miss Marple. It was here long before my tenure." Craddock turned to his sergeant. "We need to get Dr. Mason to examine the remains. See if we can establish the time of death." As the men set to work, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the vicarage grounds. The shed stood at the far end, backed by an overgrown hedge that bordered the estate of Colonel Geoffrey Bainbridge, an old military man known for his strict demeanour and love of order. Her mind ticked over the implications. By afternoon, the doctor provided his preliminary findings. "I'd say these remains are at least 20 years old, maybe older. No obvious signs of trauma, but we'll know more after a thorough examination." Craddock exhaled sharply. "That doesn't narrow things down much." Miss Marple, however, seemed lost in thought. 20 years, she murmured. "That would place us in the late 1920s or early 1930s, a most interesting time in village history." Craddock raised a brow. "Why so?" "Because," she said, her expression mild, "that was when Colonel Bainbridge returned from the war and purchased the adjoining estate. And not long after, his gardener, a rather mysterious fellow named Edwin Hartley, disappeared without a trace." Craddock straightened. "You think the skeleton might be Hartley?" Miss Marple gave a small, enigmatic smile. "I should say it is a possibility worth exploring, don't you think?" Miss Marple's keen blue eyes twinkled as she observed Inspector Craddock absorb the implications of her remark. He rubbed his chin, considering. "Edwin Hartley," he mused. "I don't recall any official missing persons report in his name." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "No, I don't imagine there was. His disappearance was noted at the time, of course, but it was dismissed rather quickly. You see, it was said he left quite suddenly, packed a bag and departed without notice. And, if I recall correctly, Colonel Bainbridge himself mentioned something about a disagreement between them. Craddock's expression darkened. You remember this from 20 years ago? Miss Marple smiled modestly. One remembers the little things, Inspector. I have always believed that the tiniest details are the most important. Just then, Dr. Mason stepped out of the shed, brushing dust from his hands. One oddity, Inspector, he said. There's something unusual about the positioning of the bones. The body was forced into that tool chest after rigor mortis had set in. That suggests the victim wasn't killed here. Craddock's brows lifted. So, someone moved the body afterward? Dr. Mason nodded. Precisely. And another thing, no sign of a bullet wound or skull fracture. Of course, I'll need a full examination to be sure, but this doesn't look like a case of straightforward violence. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the neighbouring Bainbridge estate. The grand house loomed beyond the hedgerow, its weathered brick facade bathed in afternoon light. Craddock followed her gaze. You think the Colonel might have something to say about this? Miss Marple smiled again, her expression unreadable. Oh, I think a great many people may have something to say, Inspector. It is simply a matter of knowing which ones to ask. That evening, Craddock arranged a visit to Colonel Bainbridge. The old soldier received them in his study, a dimly lit room lined with heavy bookshelves and trophies from a long-forgotten war. The colonel himself, though aged, retained an air of discipline. His posture was rigid, his silver moustache neatly trimmed. He regarded Craddock with cool civility, and Miss Marple with vague amusement. A skeleton in the vicarage shed, you say? His voice was clipped, precise. Most irregular, but I can't see what it has to do with me. Craddock, used to such resistance, remained impassive. We're looking into the possibility that the remains belong to a man who once worked for you, Edwin Hartley. There was the faintest hesitation, a brief flicker of something. Was it irritation or something deeper? Then Bainbridge shook his head. Hartley? Good Lord, that was years ago. Yes, he worked for me briefly, but he was unreliable. Disappeared without a word one night. I assumed he took his wages and left for greener pastures. Miss Marple's fingers traced the lace embroidery on her handkerchief. And yet, Colonel, I seem to recall you once mentioning that Hartley stole something from you. A muscle in Bainbridge's jaw twitched, or it was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple, of course, did not miss it. A minor incident, he said curtly. A misunderstanding, really. A few items went missing. Small things, nothing of consequence. Miss Marple tilted her head. Items, like military buttons, perhaps? Craddock shot her a sharp glance, but Bainbridge's reaction was more telling. His expression darkened, the lines on his face tightening ever so slightly. Ridiculous, he snapped. I have better things to do than discuss long-dead servants. Miss Marple's smile remained gentle. Of course, Colonel. And yet, it is a rather unfortunate coincidence, wouldn't you say? Bainbridge did not answer. As they left, Craddock exhaled sharply. You certainly have a way of ruffling feathers, Miss Marple. Oh, I do hope not, she said mildly. I merely enjoy observing how people react when faced with the unexpected. They reached the garden gate when a voice called out behind them. A woman stood in the fading light, wrapped in a shawl. Mrs. Bainbridge, Miss Marple murmured. The Colonel's wife, a frail woman with anxious eyes, hesitated before stepping forward. I couldn't say anything in front of my husband, she whispered, but I remember Edwin Hartley, and I remember the night he disappeared." Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. "I heard shouting," Mrs. Bainbridge continued. "My husband and Hartley were arguing in the study. Something about money or a debt, I think. And then—" She swallowed. "Then there was silence, and I never saw Hartley again." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the woman's arm. "That must have been very difficult for you, my dear." Mrs. Bainbridge's gaze darted toward the house, as if fearing she might be overheard. "He's not a bad man, you understand, but he has a temper, and he keeps secrets, more than you know." She hesitated a moment longer, then turned and disappeared. Into the house, Miss Marple exhaled softly. "Well now, Inspector, I do believe the picture is becoming clearer, don't you?" Inspector Craddock stood for a long moment, watching as Mrs. Bainbridge slipped back into the house, the heavy oak door closing behind her with a dull thud. The conversation had been brief, but revealing. Miss Marple's sharp eyes twinkled in the dimming light, her mind already turning over the implications. "She's afraid," Craddock murmured. "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet fear is often as instructive as it is concerning. People rarely fear what is wholly unknown, don't you think? More often they fear what they already understand too well." Craddock exhaled. "We'll need to question her again, but I doubt she'll speak freely with her husband in the house." Miss Marple nodded, but said nothing. Instead, her gaze swept the Bainbridge estate, lingering on a shadowy figure moving near the side of the house. Craddock followed her line of sight. "That's Jacob Radley," he muttered, "Bainbridge's groundskeeper." The man in question was lean, with a hunched posture that suggested years of hard labor. He moved with the wary air of someone accustomed to keeping to himself. Craddock signalled to a constable who strode forward and called out. Radley hesitated but eventually made his way toward them, his expression guarded. "Evening, sir," he said, his voice roughened by age and outdoor work. His eyes flickered between Craddock and Miss Marple. "You've got questions, I reckon?" "That's right," Craddock said. "How long have you been working here, Radley?" The groundskeeper scratched his chin. "Oh, must be near 25 years now." Miss Marple's voice was light, conversational. "So you would remember Edwin Hartley?" Radley's gaze sharpened. "Hartley? Aye, I remember him well enough." Craddock studied the man's face. "What do you remember?" Radley hesitated. He wasn't much liked. Kept to himself mostly, but he had a way of getting into trouble, he did. Liked the drink, and liked money even more. "Did he owe anyone money?" A beat of silence. Then Radley exhaled through his nose. "Rumour was he owed the colonel a fair sum. There was talk he'd been dipping his fingers where he shouldn't." Miss Marple's fingers smoothed the fabric of her glove. "You mean stealing?" Radley glanced over his shoulder toward the house before nodding ever so slightly. "That's what they said. But I never saw nothing myself." Craddock folded his arms. "And the night he disappeared?" Radley shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't working that night. But the next morning, there was a bit of a stir. The colonel was in one of his moods. The staff were whispering, and then—" He hesitated again, his gaze wary. "Then Hartley was gone." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but firm. "And you didn't think that odd?" Radley's mouth tightened. "Odd things happen when you work for men like Bainbridge." A flicker of something passed across Craddock's face. "Did you ever look in the garden shed of the vicarage?" Radley's brows furrowed. Can't say, as I had any reason to. Craddock watched him closely. No reason at all. Radley's jaw tensed. Then, with a small shake of his head, he muttered, "No, sir," and turned back toward the house before Craddock could press further. The inspector exhaled sharply. He knows more than he's letting on. Miss Marple nodded, watching Radley disappear into the gathering dusk. "Yes, but did you notice, Inspector? It was not the question of Hartley's disappearance that unsettled him. It was the shed." Craddock frowned. "You think he knew the body was there?" "I think," Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling, "that he very much wanted us to believe he did not." The next morning, they made their way to the village post office, a place where news travelled faster than the post itself. The postmistress, Miss Clara Weatherby, greeted them with eager curiosity. She was a thin woman with sharp features and a sharper tongue. "Oh, Inspector," she gushed as he stepped inside. "And Miss Marple, my word, what excitement! A skeleton in the vicarage shed." "Why, we haven't had such scandal since old Mr. Barrett was found in his rhubarb patch with—" Yes, Miss Weatherby," Craddock interrupted. "We're here about Edwin Hartley. Do you remember him?" Miss Weatherby pursed her lips. "Oh, indeed I do. A most disagreeable man, if you ask me. Always seemed to be watching people, listening in where he wasn't wanted." "Did he ever send any letters?" Miss Marple inquired pleasantly. Miss Weatherby's face brightened at the chance to recall details. "Why, yes. Now that you mention it, he did send the occasional letter. Not many, mind you. But I do recall one rather peculiar thing. He received a telegram once. I remember because he looked quite troubled when he read it." Craddock leaned forward. "A telegram? When was this?" "Oh, it must have been right before he disappeared. And do you know, I remember something else. He never came to collect a letter that arrived for him a few days later." Miss Marple's fingers tapped gently against the counter. "Do you happen to remember where the telegram was from?" Miss Weatherby frowned. "London, I believe." Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "Would you happen to know what became of the letter that went uncollected?" "Oh, well, that's the funny thing. It stayed in the undelivered mail pile for some time, but eventually someone came to collect it." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Who?" Miss Weatherby's eyes darted around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then she leaned in slightly. "Colonel Bainbridge." Craddock let out a slow breath. "You're certain?" "As certain as I am standing here, Inspector." Outside, Craddock muttered a curse under his breath. So Bainbridge was intercepting Hartley's correspondence. That's significant. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Yes, Inspector. And don't you find it intriguing that Bainbridge insisted Hartley left in a hurry, yet he was still receiving mail?" Craddock's jaw tightened. "Which means Hartley may not have left at all. He may have been silenced." Miss Marple's smile was faint, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or, more precisely, Inspector, hidden." Inspector Craddock paced the length of his office, the rhythmic sound of his boots against the wooden floor, the only noise in the otherwise silent room. Miss Marple sat primly in the chair opposite his desk, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but as yet they did not form a clear picture. Bainbridge had intercepted Hartley's letter, but why? And what had been in that telegram from London that had so unsettled the missing man? "Everyone seems to have a reason to be tangled up in this," Craddock muttered. Bainbridge, with his missing letter. His wife, afraid of what she knows. Radley, acting shifty at the mere mention of the shed, and Hartley himself, deep in debt, involved in theft, yet suddenly receiving urgent telegrams from London. He exhaled sharply. I don't like it. There are too many motives flying about. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, Inspector. But you see, that is rather the problem, isn't it? When there are too many possible reasons, it usually means we have not yet identified the right one. Craddock stopped pacing. What are you thinking, Miss Marple? Her blue eyes twinkled. That perhaps we are looking at this quite the wrong way round. You see, everyone assumes Hartley was a thief, a man in debt, a troublesome character who simply vanished. But let us consider another possibility. What if Hartley wasn't the villain of this story at all? What if he was the victim long before he was a skeleton in the vicarage shed? Craddock frowned. You think he was targeted? Miss Marple nodded. Perhaps he knew something he shouldn't have, or someone believed he did. The Intercepted letter suggests that whatever was in it, Bainbridge did not want it to reach Hartley. But more curiously, he did not destroy it. He kept it, which means it held some kind of significance. Craddock rubbed his chin. So we need to find out what was in that letter. Indeed. And I believe there is one person who might help us. They returned to Bainbridge Hall that afternoon, but this time their inquiry was not aimed at the Colonel. Instead, they asked for Mrs. Bainbridge. The butler hesitated before admitting them, but the Colonel's wife appeared soon after, her face pale and anxious. I don't know what more I can say, she murmured, as she led them into the sitting room, wringing her hands. I told you about the argument, about the shouting that night. My husband has always been proud. He would not like me speaking. Out of turn, Miss Marple's expression was gentle. My dear, we understand. But we also believe there was a letter sent to Edwin Hartley after he disappeared, and we know your husband collected it from the post office. Mrs. Bainbridge's lips parted in surprise. A letter? Yes. And I imagine your husband never mentioned it. A flicker of hesitation crossed her features. Then, as if something inside her gave way, she whispered, No, but She hesitated. There was a night, not long after Hartley vanished, when I woke and found my husband downstairs staring at a letter by the fireplace. He didn't see me, but I watched him hold it over the flames. And then he changed his mind. He folded it up and locked it away in his desk. Craddock leaned forward. Did you see what it said? Mrs. Bainbridge shook her head. No, but he was troubled. And I know my husband well, Inspector. He is not a man easily shaken. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Do you suppose, my dear, that you might show us where he keeps that desk? The woman hesitated only a moment before nodding. She led them through the dimly lit corridors to the Colonel's study, her hands trembling slightly as she pointed to a large mahogany desk. With brass fittings, Craddock examined the lock. This will need to be forced, he murmured. Mrs. Bainbridge paled. You mustn't let him know I helped you. If he finds out. Miss Marple touched her arm reassuringly. Fear not, my dear. I do not believe the Colonel is half as formidable as he would like us to think. With a quick motion, Craddock used a small tool to force the lock open. The desk drawer slid out with a creak, revealing a pile of yellowed papers. He sifted through them until his fingers closed around an aged envelope, still sealed. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Well now, Inspector, shall we see what was so important that it had to be hidden away for 20 years? Craddock tore the envelope open carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink faded but legible. The words were few, but they were enough. Hartley, your suspicions are correct. The money came from the regiment, but not in the way you think. Meet me in London. I will explain everything. W. Harrington. Craddock's brow furrowed. Harrington? That name isn't familiar. Miss Marple, however, was already nodding. Oh, but it is, Inspector. You see, William Harrington was once Bainbridge's second-in-command during the war, and he died, quite suddenly, shortly after this letter would have arrived. Craddock exhaled sharply. So this is about stolen money? Miss Marple tapped the letter. Not just money, Inspector. Stolen war funds, funds that Bainbridge would have had access to. Craddock's mind raced. So Hartley must have figured something out, and Bainbridge knew it. That's why he intercepted the letter, because it confirmed Hartley was on the right track. He glanced toward Mrs. Bainbridge, who sat frozen, hands clasped tightly. Your husband killed him, didn't he? Tears welled in her eyes, but she said nothing. Miss Marple sighed softly. I imagine poor Edwin Hartley came here that night, perhaps hoping to confront the colonel or demand the truth. But Bainbridge could not afford to let him speak. And once Hartley was dead, well, where else to hide the body but in a place where no one would think to look? Craddock clenched his jaw. The vicarage shed. Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. And the only thing Bainbridge hadn't counted on was that eventually the past always comes back to haunt us. Mrs. Bainbridge sobbed quietly into her handkerchief. I knew he did something awful. I knew it. But I never dared to ask. I was too afraid. Craddock set the letter down. Well, Mrs. Bainbridge, I'm afraid we'll need to speak to your husband. And as Miss Marple sat back, watching the pieces of the puzzle fall into place, she sighed. Yes, Inspector. I do believe we are finally beginning to untangle this web of deception. Inspector Craddock wasted no time. With the letter in hand, he strode out of Bainbridge Hall, his jaw set, his mind made up. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, her expression unreadable. The path forward seemed clear. The evidence pointed squarely at Colonel Bainbridge. Hartley had known too much, had been silenced, and Bainbridge had hidden the body where no one would look. It was all so neat. Too neat. By the time they reached the station, Craddock had already sent a constable to bring the colonel in for questioning. The weight of the discovery, the intercepted letter, the war funds, the hidden body was enough to make an arrest. Within the hour, Bainbridge arrived, his face grim, but not, Miss Marple noted, surprised. This is absurd, he declared, his voice controlled but clipped, dragging me here like some common criminal. Craddock placed the letter in front of him. Explain this, then. You intercepted Hartley's mail. You had motive. And now we know that money was involved. Bainbridge's jaw tightened as his gaze flicked over the letter. This means nothing. It doesn't prove I killed him. Craddock leaned forward. You took that letter and hid it for 20 years. Why? Bainbridge exhaled sharply through his nose. Because it was none of Hartley's business, or yours for that matter. Miss Marple's voice, soft but firm, broke the silence. Colonel, if you did not kill Hartley, then who did? A muscle twitched in Bainbridge's jaw. I don't. No. I never saw him that night. Craddock scoffed. And we're supposed to believe that? That you just happened to hide his letter and that his body just happened to turn up on a property you oversaw. Bainbridge said nothing. Craddock pushed back from the desk, shaking his head. It's enough for now. We have motive, opportunity, and evidence. Colonel Bainbridge, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Edwin Hartley. The colonel barely reacted as the cuffs were placed on his wrists. He was escorted out of the room with a stiff military dignity, saying nothing. Craddock sighed as he watched him go. It should feel more satisfying than this, he admitted. Miss Marple studied the empty chair where Bainbridge had sat. That's because it isn't quite right. Craddock frowned. What do you mean? She folded her hands. Everything we've found, his motive, the intercepted letter, even his secretiveness, it all makes sense. And yet... Craddock's patience thinned. And yet what? Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet he never once asked what evidence we had beyond the letter. A guilty man should be concerned about what we know, what else we might find. She pursed her lips. And another thing, Inspector. He never denied intercepting the letter. He never even denied financial misconduct. But the one thing he did deny, quite firmly, was seeing Hartley that night. Craddock sighed. So, Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. So I believe him. Craddock stared at her. You think he's innocent? She lifted a gloved hand. Oh, not entirely. I do believe Colonel Bainbridge had things to hide. I suspect he was involved in some rather unscrupulous dealings during the war, and I imagine Hartley was close to uncovering something that made him nervous. But killing him? No. I do not believe Bainbridge is the kind of man who would panic and resort to murder, Craddock scoffed. If not him, then who? Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of her chair. I wonder, Inspector, if we have been so focused on the Colonel that we have overlooked someone else. Someone who stood to gain from Hartley's death. Someone who may have had access to the vicarage shed all these years. Craddock's frown deepened. You're thinking of Radley. Miss Marple gave a small nod. He was the groundskeeper, was he not? And he seemed particularly unsettled when we mentioned the shed. Craddock straightened. And if Bainbridge didn't kill Hartley, but Radley did, then we've just arrested the wrong man. Miss Marple sighed. I do believe, Inspector, that the real murderer is still watching, waiting, and now that we have made a false step, he may think it is safe to act again. A restless unease settled over Inspector Craddock as he and Miss Marple walked through the quiet village streets. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the afternoon rain having left a sheen on the cobblestones. The case should have been solved. Colonel Bainbridge had been arrested, the motive established, and the crime seemingly explained. Yet Miss Marple's doubt gnawed at the edges of certainty. The old woman had a way of sensing when something was amiss, and Craddock had long since learned to trust that instinct. We should have another word with Radley, Craddock muttered as they neared the vicarage. Something about his manner didn't sit right with me. Miss Marple gave a thoughtful hum. Yes. But before we do, Inspector, I wonder if we might take a small detour. Craddock glanced at her. Where to? To the parish records. He raised an eyebrow. You think we'll find something useful there? Miss Marple's expression was serene. I have always found, Inspector, that the past has a curious way of influencing the present. They made their way to St. Mary's Church, where Reverend Finch, a kindly but absent-minded man, welcomed them inside. The scent of old parchment and candle wax filled the air as he led them to the musty archives tucked away in the vestry. "What exactly are we looking for?" Craddock asked as he flipped through the brittle pages of old registers. Miss Marple's fingers traced the faded ink of a marriage record. "Connections, Inspector. The sort that might explain why a man's body remained hidden in a vicarage. Shed for 20 years. She paused, her finger resting on a name. "Ah. Now this is interesting." Craddock leaned over her shoulder. "Harold Radley, married in 1918, to Edith Harrington." His brow furrowed. Harrington. The same name as the man who sent Hartley that letter. Miss Marple's eyes shone with quiet triumph. "Precisely." Craddock exhaled sharply. "Radley was married to Harrington's sister. That can't be a coincidence." Miss Marple turned another page. "And if I am not mistaken, yes, here it is. William Harrington, killed in 1926, just a year after Hartley vanished." She looked up, her expression grave. "Inspector, I believe we have stumbled upon something rather more tangled than we first thought." Craddock frowned. "You think Radley killed Hartley to protect his brother-in-law?" Miss Marple pursed her lips. "I think, at the very least, Radley knew more than he ever let on, and I also think that Hartley's murder may not have been about money alone." They left, the church in silence, the weight of their discovery pressing heavily upon them. The vicarage was only a short walk away, its familiar ivy-covered walls bathed in the dim glow of the setting sun. Craddock's jaw was set as he knocked firmly on the door to Radley's cottage, just beyond the main vicarage grounds. There was no answer. Miss Marple frowned. "That's odd." Craddock knocked again. Still nothing. He exchanged a glance with Miss Marple before reaching for the handle. The door creaked open. Inside, the cottage was dark, save for the faint flicker of a dying fire. The room smelled of pipe smoke and damp wool. A single chair sat overturned by the hearth, a half-finished cup of tea abandoned on the table. Craddock's fingers twitched toward his revolver. Something's not right. "Miss..." Marple moved forward, her sharp gaze scanning the room. Her eyes fell on a stack of yellowed letters on the mantelpiece. She picked one up, her lips tightening as she read the signature. "From William Harrington," she murmured. Craddock took the letter, skimming its contents. He wrote to Radley, repeatedly. His frown deepened. "Listen to this. I cannot keep this burden forever. Sooner or later, the truth will come out. If you have any sense left, you will do what must be done before it is too late." Miss Marple exhaled. It seems William Harrington knew a secret, and Radley was involved in keeping it. Craddock's gaze flickered toward the cold fireplace. Something caught his eye. He crouched, pulling out a half-burned scrap of paper. The edges were charred, but a few words remained visible. Too many questions. Marple, Bainbridge arrested, must act before. Craddock's blood ran cold. "He knows we're on to him." Miss Marple's expression was grave. "Which means, my dear Inspector, that if Radley is indeed the real murderer, he will not sit idly by while we uncover the truth." Craddock straightened. "We need to find him. Now." But even as the words left his mouth, a chill settled in his bones. Because for the first time since the investigation began, he had the terrible feeling that they were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The air inside Radley's cottage felt heavy, as though the walls had absorbed years of secrets. Inspector Craddock's gaze swept the dimly lit room once more, taking in the disarray, the overturned chair, the unfinished tea, the scattered letters. Nothing suggested a sudden struggle, yet the absence of the man himself spoke volumes. He had either fled or was lying low, and both possibilities were troubling. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved with quiet precision, her gloved fingers tracing along the edges of a dusty writing desk. She paused at the sight of a leather-bound notebook tucked neatly into a pigeonhole, quite unlike the surrounding mess. Lifting it carefully, she flipped through its pages. "There is something rather deliberate about this," she murmured, more to herself than to Craddock. Craddock stepped closer. "What is it?" She showed him a series of ledger-style notes, meticulous in their detail. Dates, times, lists of names. Some were familiar: Bainbridge, Hartley, and, more intriguingly, William. Harrington, others were less so. Radley was keeping records, Craddock muttered, flipping through the pages. But why? Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she examined the entries. He was watching people, not just after Hartley's death, but before it. Craddock exhaled, sharply. That means he knew something long before Hartley disappeared. Miss Marple turned to the back pages, where the writing became more erratic, almost frantic. One phrase stood out, underlined repeatedly. "Too late. He's found out." Craddock's eyes darkened. "Who found out? And about what?" Miss Marple placed the notebook down with care. "I rather think, Inspector, that Radley was not just a keeper of secrets. He was a prisoner of them." Craddock turned to her. "Then we need to make him talk. But how? He's disappeared." Miss Marple tapped a finger against her chin, her eyes twinkling with thought. "I believe we must give him a reason to come to us." Craddock crossed his arms. "And how do we do that?" She smiled. "We set a trap." The following morning, word spread quickly through the village. The talk at the greengrocer's, at the post office, at the pub. It all centered on the same whispered piece of news. The police had found something new, a fresh piece of evidence, one that changed everything. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out. It was, of course, a lie. Miss Marple had suggested the ruse, knowing that if Radley were truly desperate, he would not sit idly by. He would need to act, to control the situation before this supposed new evidence could expose him. The question was how he would react. Craddock stationed plainclothes officers near Radley's cottage and around the vicarage grounds. Meanwhile, Miss Marple took a quieter approach, positioning herself near the parish church, where she had a clear view of the paths leading into the village. If Radley was lurking, he would reveal himself soon enough. The hours stretched long, but patience, as Miss Marple often reminded the impatient, was a virtue. It was nearly dusk when movement stirred at the edge of the churchyard. A hunched figure in a tattered coat slipped between the gravestones, glancing around nervously before making his way toward the vicarage. Radley. Miss Marple's hands remained folded in her lap as she observed him. His gait was stiff, his steps hesitant. He had been hiding somewhere, that much was certain. But it was not only fear that haunted his expression, it was something deeper. She rose quietly and followed at a careful distance as he circled toward the back of the vicarage. There, by the old garden shed, he paused. His hand hovered over the door latch. Then, with a sudden jerk, he pushed it open and stepped inside. Miss Marple wasted no time. She turned briskly toward the path leading to the main road, where Craddock and his men were waiting. Within moments the inspector had the shed surrounded. "Harold Radley," Craddock called, his voice firm. "Come out, slowly." There was silence. Then the door creaked open, and Radley stepped out, his face pale beneath the dimming sky. His hands trembled at his sides. He didn't try to run. Craddock stepped forward. "You've been avoiding us, Mr. Radley." Radley's lips parted, but no sound came. He swallowed hard. I had no choice." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "No choice about what, Mr. Radley?" Radley shook his head. "I didn't kill him, I swear it. But I helped cover it up." Craddock's jaw tightened. "Start talking." Radley exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "It was William Harrington." His voice cracked as he spoke the name. "He killed Hartley." Silence fell over them. Craddock stared at him. "You're saying Harrington murdered Hartley over the war funds?" Radley shook his head violently. No, it wasn't about money. It was about revenge." He swallowed hard. "Hartley knew something. Something about Harrington's past. He was going to expose it." Miss Marple tilted her head. What secret was so terrible that it was worth a man's life? Radley hesitated. Then finally he whispered, "Harrington was a traitor." Craddock's breath hitched. "What?" Radley nodded, his face stricken. "During the war, he passed information to the enemy. Hartley found out, had proof. He confronted him." His voice shook. "So Harrington killed him." Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. "And you helped him hide the body." Radley's head dropped. I didn't want to, but he threatened me. My wife, she was his sister. I had to protect her." He let out a bitter laugh. "Not that it mattered in the end. She died not long after." Craddock's mind was racing. "And where is William Harrington now?" Radley's lips pressed into a thin line. "Dead. 20 years ago." A heavy silence fell. Miss Marple clasped her hands. And yet someone still wanted to keep the truth hidden. Radley's eyes flickered with something close to terror. "You don't understand. If someone's been covering for him all these years, it means they're still out there." Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. "Which means, Inspector, that we have not yet caught the true culprit." Inspector Craddock wasted no time bringing Harold Radley into custody. The man did not resist. His shoulders slumped in resignation as he was led away. But Miss Marple's thoughts remained with his final words, the weight of them pressing upon her like a winter chill. If someone had been covering for William Harrington all these years, then that person was still active, still dangerous, and perhaps still watching. By the time Craddock returned to his office, the unease had only grown. The ledger from Radley's cottage, the one documenting Hartley's movements and the names of those involved, sat locked in the evidence cabinet. It was their strongest lead, the thread tying together years of secrets. But even as he turned, the key in the lock, something in his gut told him that the danger had not passed. Miss Marple, sensing the same silent tension, retired early that evening, though sleep did not come easily. She sat by her bedroom window at the vicarage, staring out at the moonlit village, the stillness deceptive in its calm. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was growing desperate. Desperate people made mistakes, but they also took risks. the following. Morning, Craddock arrived at the station, nodding to the constable on duty as he made his way to the evidence room. He had intended to go over the ledger once more to extract any overlooked details, but when he unlocked the cabinet and pulled it open, his breath stopped short. The ledger was gone. His pulse quickened as he rifled through the other files, but it was no use. The single most damning piece of evidence had vanished. A cold anger settled over him. He stormed to the front desk, his voice tight. "Who had access to the evidence room last night?" The constable blinked. "Just you, sir, and Sergeant Walsh." Craddock stiffened. "Walsh? He locked up after you left. Said everything was secure." Craddock wasted no time. He strode to Walsh's desk, scanning the sergeant's usual pile of paperwork, but the man was nowhere to be seen. A fresh cup of tea sat steaming, untouched. A chair pulled out, as though someone had left in a hurry. Miss Marple entered the station just then, her gaze instantly reading the set of Craddock's jaw. "Something's happened," he exhaled sharply. "The ledger's missing, and so is Walsh." She pursed her lips. "Oh dear." Craddock turned to the constable. "When was the last time you saw him?" "This morning, sir. He came in early. Said he had something urgent to check." Miss Marple's expression darkened. "And no one saw him leave?" "No, ma'am, but his bicycle's gone from the rack." Craddock was already moving, pulling on his coat. "Then we find him." Miss Marple followed, her mind working swiftly. If Sergeant Walsh took the ledger, it means he either had something to hide or was under someone's influence. Craddock nodded grimly. "And I intend to find out which." They set off through the village, making inquiries at the post office, the bakery, the inn, anywhere Walsh might have been seen. It wasn't until they reached the outskirts near the old mill that they found their first sign. The bicycle lay discarded at the side of the path, half hidden by underbrush. Its front wheel spun slightly, nudged by the breeze. Craddock's fingers tightened around his revolver as he scanned the surrounding trees. "Stay close, Miss Marple." She gave him a patient smile, but obeyed. They moved carefully toward the abandoned building. The mill had been out of use for years, its wooden beams sagging, the stone foundation cracked with age. Craddock gestured for silence, then stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of damp wood. Craddock's boots scraped against the floorboards as he advanced, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through broken windows. Then he saw him. Walsh was slumped against a pile of old sacks, his hands limp at his sides. His breath was shallow, his face pale, but most telling of all was the overturned tin container beside him, its contents spilled, ashes, the last remnants of paper turned to cinders. The ledger was gone. Miss Marple knelt swiftly beside him, pressing 2 fingers to his pulse. It was weak but steady. "He's been drugged," she murmured. Craddock's eyes blazed. Someone forced him to destroy it. Miss Marple touched the edge of the burned paper, rubbing the soot between her fingers. "And quite recently. Whoever did this was here only moments ago." Craddock cursed under his breath, scanning the room for any sign of the intruder. But they were too late. The person responsible had vanished into the trees, taking with them any remaining proof of William Harrington's betrayal, and the modern-day conspirator who still sought to bury the truth. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Walsh's face, watching as his eyelids fluttered weakly. "Inspector," she said softly, "I believe when he wakes, We shall find that he knows far more than he realizes. Craddock exhaled sharply, standing upright. Then we wait. But one thing was certain. Someone had risked everything to erase that ledger, which meant that the truth it contained was dangerous enough to kill for. Walsh stirred with a groan, his eyelids fluttering as consciousness fought to reclaim him. Miss Marple remained kneeling beside him, her hand light on his wrist, monitoring the sluggish pulse beneath her fingertips. Craddock crouched opposite her, tension sharp in his shoulders. "Walsh," he said, voice firm but quiet. "Who did this?" The sergeant's lips parted, but his throat worked soundlessly before he managed a hoarse whisper. "Didn't see. Came from behind." His eyes flickered open, dazed. "Ledger." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Yes, dear. It's gone." Walsh's brows knit together in frustration, as though his own body betrayed him by keeping him weak. "Took it from the cabinet. Was going to—" He winced, struggling to lift himself. Craddock helped steady him. "Who told you to take it?" "Didn't—" He coughed. "Didn't mean to take it for them. Thought I could hide it. Keep it safe." His gaze found Craddock's, desperate now. But they knew. A chill crept up the back of Craddock's neck. Miss Marple's expression was sympathetic. "Who knew, dear?" Walsh shook his head weakly. "No name. Just a note slipped into my pocket yesterday. Told me to take the ledger and bring it here. Said if I didn't—" His throat bobbed. "Said my wife wouldn't be safe." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Oh, my dear man." Craddock's fingers curled into fists. "And when you got here?" "Didn't even see them. Just a hand over my mouth, a smell. Chloroform, I think. Then nothing." Craddock exhaled sharply, rising to his feet. The enemy was always ahead of them, always watching. The ledger was gone, the last solid piece of evidence linking. William Harrington to a hidden hand pulling the strings even now. And worse. Whoever they were willing to attack the police to keep their secret buried. They helped Walsh back to the station, Miss Marple insisting on a warm cup of tea while Craddock dispatched constables to keep watch over Walsh's wife. The sergeant's nerves remained frayed, but he confirmed there had been no strange visitors at his home, no immediate sign of danger. Whoever had threatened him had counted on his obedience. Miss Marple tapped a thoughtful finger on her teacup. "It was not just about destroying evidence, you know." Craddock frowned. "What do you mean?" "This was meant to send a message. To you. To anyone who gets too close." Craddock's jaw tightened. "Well, they'll soon find that I don't scare easily." But just as the words left his lips, the station doors burst open. A young constable stood breathless in the entryway, face pale as milk. "Sir, you're needed immediately. There's been another murder." Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged glances before rushing out into the street. The village had been quiet only moments ago, but now a murmuring crowd was forming near the churchyard. As they pushed through, the sight that met them was grim. Dr. Lionel Humphreys, the village doctor, lay sprawled across the dewy grass, his eyes staring sightlessly at the morning sky. His medical bag lay toppled beside him, instruments scattered. A dark bruise marred his temple. But the most chilling sight was the deep gash at his throat, the blood staining his collar a deep crimson. Miss Marple's hand tightened around the strap of her handbag. Dr. Humphreys, a man who had been one of the few with access to the old files regarding William Harrington's death. A man who had mentioned only days ago that he was beginning to wonder about a few odd details in the autopsy records. Craddock knelt beside the body, examining the wound with grim efficiency. A sharp blade and clean, no sign of a struggle. He knew his attacker. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. All was taken by surprise. A constable approached, face tight. "No witnesses saw anything, sir, but we found this nearby." He held out a folded slip of paper, bloodied at one corner. Craddock carefully opened it. The writing inside was hurried, almost frantic. It was never an accident. He was murdered. "I have proof. Meet me tonight." The ink trailed off. Craddock swore under his breath. He was trying to tell someone. Miss Marple's gaze swept the crowd, her sharp eyes reading the expressions of those gathered. Some were genuinely horrified. Others whispered in fear, but there was something else. A single, fleeting look exchanged between two villagers. She followed the glance and found herself looking at Judith Radley, Harold Radley's sister. She stood stiffly among the onlookers, her knuckles white against her shawl. Next to her was Reverend Phelps, his lips pressed into a thin line. Something passed between them, unspoken yet unmistakable. Miss Marple turned to Craddock. "I believe, Inspector, that we are looking at someone who knew too much, and someone else who feared he was about to speak." Craddock's expression darkened. "Then let's start asking questions." The killer had silenced Dr. Humphreys, but the truth was still out there, and Miss Marple had every intention of finding it. Miss Marple watched the crowd disperse, whispers hanging in the air like mist after a cold morning. Dr. Humphreys' body had been carefully moved, but the stain of violence lingered. She took a breath, hands folded over her handbag. There was something here, something delicate but forming. A shape in the fog, just out of reach. Craddock returned from instructing the constables, his brow furrowed. "We need to question Radley's." "Sister and Reverend Phelps immediately," Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. But before we do, tell me, what was Dr. Humphreys doing here at the churchyard?" Craddock exhaled sharply. "That's what I'm trying to work out. He wasn't a religious man, and as far as we know, he wasn't meeting anyone." "Unless he was," Miss Marple murmured. "And unless what he found wasn't just in his papers, but something he could touch. A physical truth." Her fingers moved lightly over the latch of her handbag as her mind flicked through everything they had uncovered so far. The missing ledger, the threats against Walsh, the death of William Harrington, and now the murder of the doctor who had dared to look too closely at an old case. And then, like a lantern suddenly flickering to life in a darkened room, a single thread pulled taut in her mind. She turned to Craddock, her voice thoughtful. "Inspector, I wonder, when William Harrington was buried, do we know who tended to the arrangements?" Craddock blinked. "His family, I expect. Harold Radley, given his business connections. But what if something wasn't quite right about that burial?" Her eyes swept the graves beyond, the headstones standing solemn and silent. Dr. Humphreys was a doctor, yes, but also a man of order. If something had been done improperly, if someone had falsified records about that body, for example, it would gnaw at him until he could not let it rest. Craddock's gaze sharpened. "You think he came here to check the grave?" "I think he realized something wasn't right about William Harrington's death, and that it wasn't just about paperwork. It was about what was in the coffin." A grim silence passed between them. Then Craddock snapped into action, calling for constables to arrange an exhumation order. Miss Marple knew it would take time, and time was a luxury they could ill afford. She turned her attention back to Judith Radley, still standing stiffly by the church wall. Phelps had moved slightly away from her, as though distance might sever whatever silent connection they shared. Miss Marple approached gently. "My dear, I hope this has not been too great a shock for you." Judith Radley flinched, as though the words had cut her. Dr. Humphreys was a good man. Her voice was tight. He never hurt anyone. "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet, someone wanted him silenced. I wonder why." Judith's lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple let the silence stretch just a moment too long, watching her reaction. People who were entirely innocent were uncomfortable with quiet, eager to fill it with truth. But Judith Radley only grew more rigid, her fingers twisting in her shawl. "You see," Miss Marple continued softly, "I cannot help but think that this all began long before now. Before the ledger went missing, before Walsh was attacked, even before Dr. Humphreys decided to revisit an old case. I think, dear, that it began with a single lie. And once a lie is told, one must tell another to protect it, and then another, until one is tangled beyond escape." Judith's throat bobbed. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "And I do wonder, dear, if you were caught in that web." Judith's breath hitched, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might break. But then the moment passed, and the woman straightened, forcing her features into something cold and impassive. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple sighed. "No, I don't expect you do. Not yet." She turned away, but not before she caught the flicker of fear in Judith's eyes. Craddock rejoined her, his expression grim. "The exhumation will take time, but something tells me we're about to find the real reason Humphreys was murdered." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but I fear, Inspector, that the killer may not wait quietly while we work." For the first time, Craddock looked at her with real concern. "You think there'll be another attempt?" "I think," Miss Marple murmured, "that the pattern is becoming clear, and if we see it, then so does our murderer. And if she was right, then the next move would be the most dangerous yet." Miss Marple sat quietly in the vicarage, her gloved hands resting lightly on the delicate floral embroidery of the settee. The room was warm, the scent of old books and faintly lingering candle wax hanging in the air, yet there was an undeniable chill settling over the case. Craddock paced near the hearth, his jaw tight with frustration. The exhumation of William Harrington's grave was scheduled for the morning, but she knew they couldn't wait. The murderer had been precise, deliberate, and desperate people did not sit idly by when the walls began to close in. Reverend Phelps had taken a chair near the window, his fingers worrying the armrest, his face drawn with an anxiety that went beyond mere concern for his parishioners. Judith Radley sat stiff-backed beside him, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were pale. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "I do think, my dears, that we must now ask ourselves the most pressing question of all. Not just who committed these dreadful acts, but why." Judith's head snapped up, a flicker of defiance crossing her face before she quickly looked away. Craddock frowned. "Money's the most obvious reason. Someone stood to gain from Harrington's death." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector, this was never about money, not truly. Oh, greed has played its part, certainly, but the pattern is clearer now. Every move, every silencing, every misdirection, it was not about profit. It was about something much more deeply personal, something rooted in shame. Reverend Phelps, exhaled sharply, his fingers gripping the wooden armrest until they creaked. Judith did not move. Miss Marple turned to her, her gaze kind but unwavering. "My dear, I do believe you have been trying very hard to protect something, or rather, someone." Judith flinched, her lips parting slightly as though words hovered there, trapped behind her teeth. Craddock stepped forward. "Miss Radley, I must insist. If you know something, now is the time." Judith's shoulders trembled, but she remained silent. Miss Marple sighed, reaching into her handbag. She retrieved a small folded piece of yellowed paper, the last remaining fragment of the stolen parish ledger. This was found among Dr. Humphrey's things. You see, before it was torn away, this record shows an entry, one that was meant to be forgotten. A birth, Miss Radley, one that should not have existed. Judith sucked in a breath, her whole body tensing like a bowstring about to snap. Miss Marple's voice softened. "It was William Harrington's, wasn't it? But not as Harold Radley's nephew, as his son." A silence fell so heavy it seemed to press the air from the room. Phelps closed his eyes as if in silent prayer. Judith let out a ragged breath. "You have no proof." "I don't need proof, dear. Not anymore. You see, the truth has been trying to surface from the very start. Dr. Humphreys suspected it, and someone killed him to keep it hidden. The missing ledger, the false records, it was all to erase the fact that William was Harold Radley's illegitimate child. And I suspect that was something Harold could never allow to come to light." Judith trembled. "You don't understand." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but firm. "Oh, but I do. Harold Radley built his entire reputation on respectability. A child born out of wedlock, especially to a woman who was, perhaps, not of the right sort, would have shattered his standing. So he arranged for the boy to be raised as his nephew, cared for, but never acknowledged as his own. But something changed, didn't it? William must have found out." Judith let out a small broken sound. "He confronted my father." Miss Marple nodded. "And your father could not bear the scandal, so he silenced him." Judith's breath was shallow, her nails digging into her palms. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know at first." Craddock's expression darkened. "But you found out." Her lips trembled. "Afterward, She shut her eyes, anguish carving deep lines into her face. "I found my father in his study that night. He looked tired, more than usual, and he told me it was done, that William wouldn't trouble us any more." Phelps's voice was hoarse. "My God," Miss Marple sighed, "and you've been protecting him ever since." Judith's breath hitched. "He was my father." Her voice cracked. "I didn't want to believe he had done it. I told myself there had to be another explanation. But when Dr. Humphreys started digging, when he told me he suspected William's death wasn't what it seemed, I panicked. I warned my father, and I think that's when he realized Humphreys would never let it rest." Craddock's jaw tightened. "So Harold Radley killed him too." Judith's head moved in a small, broken nod. "Yes. And now he's gone." Her voice was almost a whisper. "And I don't know what's left." Miss Marple watched her with something like sorrow. "The truth, dear. The truth is all that remains now." Craddock exhaled, his shoulders heavy with the weight of it all. "We'll need a full confession." Judith nodded numbly. "Yes, I know." As Craddock stepped forward to take her statement, Miss Marple turned to the window. gazing out into the vicarage garden where the afternoon light slanted through the trees. The past had refused to stay buried, no matter how deeply someone had tried to conceal it, and in the end it was not greed nor simple ambition that had driven Harold Radley to kill. It was shame, the shame of an unforgiven past, and the fear of being exposed. It was a story she had seen before, in different forms, different families. Secrets always found their way to the surface, no matter how carefully they were hidden. And sometimes the greatest crimes were not born out of hatred, but out of the desperate, doomed attempt to rewrite the past. Miss Marple sat at the vicarage table, the room dimly lit by the evening glow of the oil lamp. The fire had burned low in the grate, the air thick with the weight of what had just been revealed. Across from her, Judith Radley sat motionless, her hands limp in her lap, her face pale. Inspector Craddock stood nearby, arms crossed. His expression grim. There was one final step to take. Miss Marple smoothed a hand over the tablecloth, her voice calm, almost gentle. "My dear, there is something we must be clear on. You say you learned the truth after William Harrington had already died, that you only sought to protect your father afterward." Judith swallowed hard. Yes. And yet, Miss Marple continued, there is something I cannot quite reconcile. If your father alone was responsible for William's death, then why, after all these years, did someone else go to such great lengths to cover it up? To silence Dr. Humphreys? To steal the evidence? Judith flinched but said nothing. Craddock's jaw tightened. Because there's more to it, isn't there? Silence. Then, at last, Judith let out a slow, shuddering breath. Yes. Miss Marple's hands folded in her lap. The truth, dear. Before it is too late. Judith raised her head, and there was something hollow in her eyes. It wasn't just my father. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I helped him. Craddock took a step forward, but Miss Marple raised a hand urging patience. Judith's voice shook. That night, when William came to confront my father, I heard everything. I heard William shouting. I heard my father pleading with him to keep it quiet. And then I heard the struggle. She closed her eyes. When I ran in, it was already done. William was on the floor, my father standing over him, shaking. She pressed her fingers to her temples. But he wasn't dead. He was still breathing, still alive. Miss Marple's breath caught. Judith's voice cracked. I should have helped him. I should have done something. But all I could think about was what it would mean if anyone found out. If the truth about William got out, my father's whole life would have been ruined. Our name, our standing, everything he had worked for would be gone. Her fingers curled into fists. So I helped him. We carried William out into the garden, into the shed, and then we left him there. Her shoulders hunched. It was cold that night. The temperature dropped. Craddock's voice was tight. You left him to die. Judith nodded, her face wet with silent tears. Miss Marple exhaled softly. And you've been covering it up ever since. Judith gave a small, broken laugh. It started as a lie of omission, then a necessary lie, then another and another, until I didn't know how to stop. When Dr. Humphreys started looking into William's death, I panicked. I didn't know what he had found, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he uncovered the truth. So I told my father. Her hands trembled. And he killed him. To protect me. Craddock's expression was unreadable. And what about the missing evidence, the stolen parish records? Judith swallowed. I burned them. The silence stretched, the crackling of the dying fire the only sound in the room. Miss Marple, her face touched with sorrow, said, You know what must happen now. Judith's lips parted as though she wanted to protest, to beg for mercy. But she only nodded. Craddock moved to place a hand on her shoulder, but before he could, a loud, sharp crack split the air. The sound of glass shattering. In an instant, Craddock lunged, knocking Miss Marple out of the way as the window pane behind them exploded inward. A gunshot. A second one. Judith shrieked and dove to the floor as Craddock reached for his revolver. Miss Marple, shaken but unhurt, turned her head toward the source. Through the jagged remnants of the window, she caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, dark against the fading twilight, disappearing into the hedgerow beyond the vicarage garden. Craddock was already moving, shoving the door open, pursuing into the night. Miss Marple steadied herself, breathing deeply. Judith was curled in a heap, shaking, her face streaked with terror. Who? She gasped. Miss Marple adjusted her hat with steady hands. I imagine we are about to find out. In the distance, the sound of running footsteps faded into the dark. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, though her heart pounded against her ribs. Outside, the hurried crunch of footsteps in the gravel grew fainter as Craddock pursued the fleeing figure into the darkness. The vicarage sat in uneasy silence, the scent of cordite from the gunshots hanging in the air. Judith Radley had pulled herself into a chair, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table, her breathing ragged. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, adjusting the lace cuffs of her cardigan. Then her eyes flicked toward the shattered window, her mind quietly working through the implications. The shot had been fired from outside, aimed at Judith. Not at herself, nor Craddock. Someone still wished to silence her. A slow creak in the hallway beyond the sitting room made Miss Marple turn sharply. The vicarage door had been left ajar when Craddock rushed out, but the sound had come from inside. A presence still lurked within. Judith's eyes widened. Someone's here. Miss Marple nodded once, rising with measured grace. She took a candle from the table, the only source of light beyond the fire's dying embers. The hallway was dim, but Miss Marple's keen gaze caught the shadow lingering near the bookcase. A figure, barely concealed, watching. Come now, she said gently. There's no use in hiding. The figure hesitated, then slowly stepped forward. Reverend Phelps. His usual mild countenance had twisted into something strained, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. He glanced toward Judith, then back at Miss Marple. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this, he murmured. Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. Indeed, the Reverend exhaled, and to her surprise a small, weary smile flickered across his face. You always were far too perceptive, Miss Marple. Behind them, Judith let out a small gasp. You... But why? The Reverend sighed, stepping further into the light. For the same reason you did, my dear. To protect a legacy. He gestured toward the shattered window. That shot wasn't meant to kill you, just to ensure you didn't talk any further. Judith recoiled as though struck. Miss Marple, however, remained unruffled. You were the one who removed the evidence from the church records, she stated plainly. The Reverend gave a slow nod. I did. When Humphreys began asking questions about William's past, I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth unraveled. So I intervened. I destroyed the records. I tried to persuade Humphreys to let the matter go. A shadow crossed his face. But he wouldn't. Miss Marple's voice was almost kind. And so you silenced him. Reverend Phelps clasped his hands together, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. I didn't intend to. But once the truth was out, it was no longer just about protecting a man's reputation. It was about protecting the very foundation of the parish. A scandal like this would have shattered everything. His eyes flickered toward Judith. And I owed your father that much. Judith's breath hitched. My father? The Reverend hesitated. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, Your father wasn't the one who struck the fatal blow that night. It was me. Silence crashed over the room like a wave. Judith shook her head violently. No, that's not true. I found William. Before you did, he said, his voice hoarse. Your father had already hurt him, yes, but he was still breathing. He begged me to help him, to do what was right, but I saw only a man who would destroy everything your father built, everything I had dedicated my life to. Miss Marple folded her hands before her. And so you ensured his silence. The Reverend bowed his head. I told myself it was necessary, that God would forgive me. A dry, humorless chuckle escaped him. But I've lived with it every day since. Footsteps pounded against the path outside. Craddock's voice called out sharply as he approached the house, his revolver still drawn. The Reverend stiffened. Miss Marple spoke softly, but there was steel in her tone. It's over, Reverend. For a moment he stood frozen, his eyes darting between them. Then, with a resigned nod, he exhaled and turned toward the doorway as Craddock stepped in, breathless but alert. We caught the gunman, Craddock announced grimly. Local farmhand, paid off by someone to scare Judith quiet. But he won't be talking much. He ran straight into an old well. His eyes swept the room, pausing on the Reverend. Though I suspect we have our true culprit right here. Miss A. Marple nodded. Yes, I believe we do. The Reverend closed his eyes briefly before extending his wrists. Do what you must, Inspector. Craddock stepped forward, snapping the handcuffs around the man's wrists with practiced efficiency. As he led him toward the door, the Reverend hesitated, looking back at Judith. I did it for your father, he said, his voice barely audible. For you. But Judith turned away, silent tears streaking her face. As the door closed behind them, Miss Marple let out a small sigh. She reached for the candle, its tiny flame flickering in the quiet room. Turning to Judith, she placed a gentle hand over hers. My dear, the past has a way of catching up with us no matter how deeply we try to bury it. Judith, her voice raw, whispered, I don't know how to live with this. Miss Marple gave her a soft, knowing smile. Then perhaps, my dear, it is time to start anew. And with that, the last shadows of the past finally began to fade. As dawn broke over St. Mary Mead, the village sat in an uneasy quiet. The scandal of the past few days would linger for years, whispered over garden fences and in the pews of St. Anne's Church. But for now, the vicarage, once a place of sanctuary, stood as a silent witness to the truths that had unravelled within its walls. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, her hands resting lightly on her lap, as Inspector Craddock returned, his expression weary but satisfied. He removed his hat and exhaled. It's done, he said. Phelps has confessed to everything. He'll be charged with the murder of William Radley, as well as obstruction and destruction of evidence. And the farmhand. Well, with the right pressure. He admitted to being paid off to frighten Miss Radley, but he didn't know who arranged it. Phelps used an intermediary. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. The Reverend was clever in that regard. He knew to keep his hands as clean as possible, even when they were already stained beyond redemption. Craddock dropped into a chair opposite her. "What I don't understand," he admitted, rubbing his chin, "is how you saw through him when no one else did. He was the last person I suspected." Miss Marple gave a small smile, reaching for her knitting. "Oh, my dear, people so often mistake goodness for perfection. A reverend is expected to be beyond reproach, which makes it all the easier for him to hide in plain sight. But guilt, Inspector, has a way of manifesting itself, no matter how deep one buries it." Craddock leaned forward. "Go on." She began to knit, the rhythmic movement of the needle soothing. The first clue was, of course, the missing records. It was clear that someone had tampered with them, and the only person with access and motive to do so was the Reverend. Then there was the nature of William Radley's murder. It wasn't a crime of passion, but one of necessity. Someone needed him silenced. That suggested a secret worth killing for. She paused, glancing toward the window where the morning light streamed in. But the real moment of certainty came when Judith Radley recounted her father's confession. You see, it was incomplete. He admitted to the altercation, to the attack, but not to the killing itself. That gap in the story was telling. And who else but someone deeply involved in the family would have had both the opportunity and the motive to finish what had been started? Craddock nodded slowly. "And the attempt on Judith's life?" Miss Marple sighed. "A desperate act by a desperate man. She was the last threat to his secret. When intimidation didn't work, he had to ensure she stayed silent permanently." Craddock shook his head. "He nearly got away with it." Miss Marple gave him a sharp look. "But he didn't." Craddock chuckled dryly. "No, he didn't, thanks to you." Miss Marple smiled politely, but said nothing. Outside, the sound of a car engine rumbled as the police transport took Reverend Phelps away. Justice, it seemed, had been served. And yet Miss Marple's fingers paused over her knitting. There was something, a thread left untied. She could feel it just out of reach. But when she reached for it, it slipped through her grasp. Craddock noticed her change in expression. "Something wrong?" She hesitated. Then, shaking her head, she resumed knitting. "No, my dear. Just an old woman's habit of thinking too much." But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. As the last of the police cars disappeared down the lane, the village of St. Mary Mead seemed to exhale, returning to its usual stillness. The scandal that had shaken its quiet streets would soon become just another story, passed along in hushed voices over garden hedges and in the corners of the grocer's shop. But as Miss Marple watched the road from her sitting-room window, she felt an unfamiliar unease settling over her. The case was solved. Justice had been served. And yet, she turned away from the window and walked to the small table where a cup of tea sat cooling. As she lifted it, her gaze landed on a letter resting beside it. It was the letter that had first drawn her into this tangled affair. Judith Radley's frantic words pleading for help. She had read it countless times, but something compelled her to look again. Judith had written of strange noises, of someone watching her in the dark, of shadows that moved when they shouldn't. But now Miss Marple knew that the attempt on Judith's life had been made by someone hired through an intermediary. Phelps had taken great care to distance himself, so why, then, had Judith been frightened before that? She set down her tea, her mind sharpening. Phelps had arranged the final attack, yes, but what of the earlier threats? Could it have been Phelps all along, using different methods? It was possible, but it was also possible, perhaps even likely, that someone else had been moving in the way. Shadows before he ever took action. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Craddock stood outside, his coat damp from the morning mist. "Sorry to intrude, Miss Marple. I just wanted to be certain. Do you feel we got it all right?" Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. "I was just considering that very question. Inspector, tell me, when you searched the vicarage, did you find any record of Phelps's arrangements with his hired man?" Craddock frowned. "No, nothing written down. He must have been careful not to leave a trail." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Careful indeed. And yet he was desperate in the end. Desperate men make mistakes, Inspector, and I fear we may have overlooked one." She crossed the room to the small bureau where she kept her correspondence and pulled out another letter, this one much older. "I received this some weeks before Judith's," she explained, handing it to him. Craddock read it aloud. "Dear Aunt Jane, I hope you are well. Things have been most peculiar here of late. Someone has been asking about Father's past, though I cannot say who. I feel unsettled. Do you think I am being silly? Perhaps I am, but I should so love to see you again. Yours, Judith." He lowered the letter, his brow furrowing. This was before Phelps took action. "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Which means someone else, someone unknown, was already stirring the waters, and I do not believe that person has yet been accounted for." Craddock sighed. "You're suggesting there's another player in this mess?" Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "I am suggesting, my dear Inspector, that a mystery never truly ends. It merely changes shape." Craddock looked at the letter again, then at Miss Marple. "Do you have a theory?" "Oh, I have several," she said lightly, returning to her seat and picking up her knitting once more. "But theories are only useful when one has proof, and I suspect in time the proof will reveal itself." Outside, a crow cawed from the garden, the sound stark in the crisp morning air. Craddock shook his head. "You know, Miss Marple, sometimes I think you enjoy keeping the rest of us in suspense." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she resumed her knitting. "Oh, but where would the fun be if I didn't?" And though the village had returned to its peaceful routine, Miss Marple knew that somewhere, perhaps in the echo of Judith's unease, or in the missing pages of a story yet to be told, the next mystery was already waiting.